Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on ideas of globalisation, I'm talking to Gary Gerstle about the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is the last time that the American government tried its hand at tariffs. Gary's going to explain what happened, why they did it, and how it went wrong. Smoot and Hawley, two very obscure politicians whose names have gone down in infamy. And we're also going to be talking about why, given all of that, we're back there again. We should probably start with McKinley, though we're going to be talking primarily about events in the 20s and 30s. But we talked a little bit to Mark Palin about Donald Trump's obsession with McKinley and his repeated invocation of that time. And there is the celebrated McKinley tariff. The thing I hadn't fully appreciated, actually, until we talked to Mark Palin about it, in my mind, I thought the McKinley tariff must refer to his presidency, but of course it doesn't. It refers to the act that's named after him when he was a congressman because, and this is going to be absolutely crucial to what we're talking about, at that period, tariff policy was the remit of Congress. So can you just tell us a little bit about the 1890s and beyond? Where did tariff policy stand and how did McKinley get his name on it?
Well, the United States had been leaning toward protectionism in regards to its industry for some time. It perceived itself to be an underdog relative to the primacy of Great Britain, and it felt that in order for its industries to flourish, they could only do so behind a protectionist wall. So it's important to see the McKinley tariff not as breaking with a pattern of free trade, but increasing the tariff rates. And this had long been an article of faith among the industrialist constituency in the United States. There were also serious opponents, and the opposition was rooted most deeply in the Democratic Party and in agricultural regions of the country, because agricultural exports were America's major export, and American farm producers and cotton producers had great dominance in the world, and so they wanted a free trade. They were comfortable with a free trade economy that Great Britain was trying to push, and so they were deeply opposed to tariffs. And both the McKinley tariff of 1890 and then another tariff bill in 1894 are fiercely fought between Democrats and Republicans. But McKinley is important not just for the tariff, but for his ability to consolidate Republican power for a generation. If you look at the United States between the 1860s and the 1890s, it's hard to identify a dominant political party. Clearly, the Republicans are dominant through Reconstruction, but once the Confederates, formerly Confederate states, are readmitted to full membership in the United States, the Democratic Party and its fortunes revive. And McKinley stands out not simply for his ability in 1890 to pass a tariff bill, but through his winning the presidency in 1896 to make those level of tariffs enduring really for a generation. The Republican Party arguably is the dominant party in American politics from the 1890s through the 1920s, and protectionism of industry is a cardinal principle of what they're trying to do. So it's important to see McKinley, his presidency, as executing the dominance that the 1890 McKinley tariff had promised.
But as you say, it was fiercely fought, particularly in Congress, because this is where tariff policy was made. And I was looking up the back and forth. So you had the McKinley tariff, then you had the Wilson-Gorman Act, which lowered the tariffs. Then you had the Dingley Tariff Act under McKinley's presidency, which raised tariffs again. Then you had the Payne-Aldrich Act, which lowered tariffs again. Now, these are not names, apart from McKinley, that ring out. And the Wilson in Wilson-Gorman is not Woodrow Wilson. These are members of Congress, some of them relatively prominent, some of them relatively obscure. But Congress was the battleground for this form of politics. And it is one of the big differences with now. We're going to come back to this. Presidents were, in a way, bystanders, weren't they, to this politics?
Yes, you could say that given the importance of tariff legislation in terms of shaping a country and a world economic system, and that's an issue we're facing very much and very deeply today, that these are issues that ought to be debated at length in the legislative arena where the people have a strong voice. And yes, presidents can work with their congressional parties to get their agendas achieved, but they understood very, very clearly that any tariff policy that's going to have a major, major impact on the country was going to have to get through Congress. And this is true of the 1890s. It's true of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And arguably, you could say this is where tariff policy belongs, given its importance to the state of the nation and its relationship to the world, and that the people, through their representatives, ought to have a very strong voice in determining that policy, which was the case then.
So we're going to come on to why it isn't the case now. But I should say, reading about these earlier tariff fights, economists conventionally despair when politicians talk about economic matters, and it was no different back then. So we might think this belongs in the deliberative assembly where these issues can be thrashed out and given their due respect. But economists looking at these arguments saw politicking and log rolling and graft, and they saw the US Congress acting in the way that it was often assumed that it always acted, particularly when matters of economic interest were at stake. These weren't high principled arguments. These were arguments among congressmen about the interests of their constituents, narrowly conceived, in which really this was about trade-offs.
Yes, and you're pointing the way to Smoot-Hawley, which we will get to eventually, which is seen as the pinnacle of that kind of log rolling. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You give me protectionism for the major commodity produced in my district, and I will do the same for you. And so, yes, there is a buildup of sentiment, even across the progressive era into the 1920s, that Congress perhaps is where this belongs, but the question arises, can Congress handle this issue responsibly and give the United States the kind of tariff policy it needs? And it's a dilemma that functions like a pendulum, and there's going to be a swing to one side. And I think in the 21st century now, with Trump being president, questions are once again being raised whether there ought not to be a much stronger congressional voice in deliberating and deciding what the tariff policy of a country should be.
Congress looks like a great deliberative assembly when it's not given an opportunity to debate a matter, because then you can imagine some idealized version of it. Even before Smoot-Hawley, when people saw it in action, there was a feeling this matter is too serious to be left to the congressman from Nebraska or whatever it is to thrash it out.
Right. And there's also a significant back and forth struggle between the two parties. The significance of the tariff issue in American politics cannot be underestimated. It's a huge issue for Democrats and Republicans. And the one tariff piece of legislation that you did not mention was the Underwood-Simmons Act of 1913, when Wilson comes into power, which reduces the effective tariff rate to an average of 25% from 40%. And this is thought at the time to be a great Democratic victory, not just big D Democratic Party, but small d for ordinary people, because the critique of the Republican Party was that this was benefiting producers, manufacturers, allowing revenues to accumulate in their coffers, but obligating ordinary working men and women to pay higher prices in the marketplace when they went to purchase their goods. And with Wilson becoming the first Southern president to be elected since prior to the Civil War, Democratic Party is still heavily invested in its Southern agricultural regions. And Wilson is also trying to bring in Northern working men and women into his coalition. So reduction of the tariff is meant to satisfy both the agricultural producers of the South and Northern working men and women. And that becomes the basis of a coalition and the effort to interrupt McKinley-style dominance, which lasts for 2 terms and is ended by the anger in America about the way in which World War I is resolved.
So let's take the story forward then to the late 1920s. We'll get on to who Smoot and Hawley were. I have to admit I'm not massively familiar with their work, except they put their name to this notorious piece of legislation. Why did tariff policy rise back up the agenda for the Republican Party? Again, we're talking about Republicans pushing this. Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928. This is still congressional, not presidential politics, but Hoover's going to have a say in this argument too. Why were Republicans coming back to tariffs at this point as a major plank in their platform? And I should emphasize these arguments arose before the crash. So we're not talking about a response to something that happened in 1929. And indeed, you could say a big part of the problem here is there wasn't a lot of adaptation to before and after the crash of 1929. Before that happened, why tariffs again?
Well, the first thing to be said is that the tariff plank never really left the Republican Party. They come back into office in 1921. And in 1922, they pass another tariff act, which has obeisance to the McKinley principle. Tariffs are back up to 40%. The American industry and manufacturing is flourishing throughout the 1920s. So the first thing to be said is that this seems to be a continuation of good Republican policy protecting American industry and manufacturers. That's been going on since the 1890s, and whenever the Republicans come back into power, they want to get that tariff rate close to 40%. The big difference in the 1920s is the crisis in America's agricultural sector. American agriculture had expanded enormously during the First World War. It was stimulated, too, by the federal government. The breadbaskets of Europe had been destroyed by war. The opportunity to export reached all-time highs. And then this continues after the war in Herbert Hoover's earlier role as the Commissioner for Food Relief in Europe, and America trying to save Europe and Europeans from starvation. So the expansion is enormous across a 6 or 7 year period. And then as reconversion gathers steam, as Europe recovers its ability to produce grain and other critical agricultural materials, and World War I had the effect of integrating the world economy much more deeply, so that agricultural products were also coming from other parts of the world, from South Asia, from North Africa. And so suddenly the competition intensifies. The American producers are completely unprepared for this. And there is a real economic crisis in America in the 1920s in agriculture. Farmers suffering, losing land, feel they can't compete, and they're looking at all the benefits that are accruing to industrialists, and they say, we want this as well. We just want parity with what industry is getting. If they're getting protection, we want protections. This is a historic conversion on the part of agricultural producers, which also generates support within the Democratic Party for tariffs of the sort that had not been there before. And industrialists begin to say, we're prospering under these conditions. They, I don't think, had reckoned with the degree to which their own economic circumstances had changed. America in the 1920s is no longer an upstart industrial economy. It is the premier industrial economy in the world. It does not need the kind of tariff protections it arguably had needed before. The forward-thinking people in their ranks, including people like Henry Ford, are saying, the world is our oyster. We don't need these tariff protections. Let's get rid of them. But many American manufacturers are operating out of reflex. Economically, this has worked for a long period of time. Their representatives are operating out of reflex, and the response to the demands in the agricultural sector are to say, okay, you get your tariffs, we'll get some more for ourselves. And it should be said that there's a political dimension to this, which has to do not strictly with economics, but anger in America about the outcome of the war. You might think that Americans were happy with the outcome of the war. America entered on the victorious side. Their president was an architect of the Treaty of Versailles, but of course, all the unhappiness with the Treaty of Versailles, the rejection by the Senate of Wilson's principle, the feeling begins to spread in America that America's involvement in World War I had been a catastrophic mistake, that Wilson had promised democracy for the world, but had just brought a great deal more misery, and that the chief beneficiaries of the war were American munition makers and other capitalists who fed at the government trough. And so there's a deep reaction in America to resume its older ways. And its older ways are not simply about tariffs, they're about isolating America from Europe and its contaminating effects. And this is a very powerful feeling in America in the 1920s. And some of the people voting for tariffs are also some of the people extremely unhappy about what they had concluded about the nature of American involvement in World War I. That had been a colossal mistake, that America should resume being what it had been, preserving its experiment with liberty and republicanism, small r republicanism, in a way that did not allow the rivalries and intrigue of European princes and kings and others to contaminate what had been a very successful experiment. So this also fuels the sense that America should separate from Europe, and it fuels support for tariffs. It's not strictly an economic argument, but it's a political argument that makes the turn toward even greater tariffs seem like the right thing to do. And all this is going on, and all these deep discussions and hearings are happening before the Great Depression. And it needs to be said that no one in America expected this Great Depression to happen. Hoover in 1928 runs on the platform that we are nearer to the end of poverty than any society in the history of the world. No one else can imagine the magnitude of the calamity that is coming, and so they have no really way of planning the kind of future that needed to be planned.
As you describe it there, it sounds like, I know it's more complicated, but it sounds like the politics is quite simple in a way. So two things are going on, one of which is the economics is as simple as a view. Industry and manufacturing are booming and they have tariffs. Agriculture is struggling and we or they don't have tariffs. So QED, let's have more tariffs. And secondly, tariffs are a kind of payback to the world for having dragged America in to a series of wars fought under Wilson under high principles, but in the end, they looked like a kind of almost an exploitation of the United States by a world that is not now appreciating just what America did for it. Now, we can come back to the economic arguments, but that political argument really does feel like an earlier version of something that we're seeing today. I mean, do you see, so we'll come on to Smoot-Hawley in a second, but do you see parallels there in the sense that with the Trump agenda, we have a case for tariffs made in economic terms, but behind it, it feels like there's a resentment, a deep resentment, not just Trump personally, but among many of his supporters, for a world in which the United States had not just been economically exploited, but kind of militarily ensnared, partly because of the corruption of its own political class, in a series of conflicts. And tariffs almost might symbolize a kind of putting up the wall.
Absolutely.
It's the same story.
They are chapters in the same book. They're different chapters, but one can draw a straight line from this emerging isolationism of the 20s into the reluctance in the late 30s about America getting into another war. If you're a university student in America in the late 30s, one of the most powerful sentiments is that America was wrongly pulled in to World War I by the nefarious machinations of England and France and by an earlier kind of globalist elite that was not acting in the interests of ordinary Americans.
Just to say, that classic mix of naive idealists in politics and ruthless, cynical arms dealers, that kind of mix of, which I think you do hear echoes of in the 21st century. You know, Davos man is simultaneously either a naive idealist or a cynical manipulator. And it's that combination of the two that feels so toxic to Americans who want to get out.
Yes. And in the 30s, this is going to be on both sides of the political spectrum. It's going to be there among progressives and it's going to be there among conservatives. And if we ask, where does America first come from, it is first articulated in the late 30s and early 40s with Charles Lindbergh and others, and Pat Buchanan and McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, Pat Buchanan, Trump. These are all connected in a similar storyline. I think what Trump doesn't understand, because he doesn't really understand American history, the longer reach of American history, is how deeply rooted this is in the American political psyche and how deeply rooted it is in the mythos of America and the story that America has been telling itself really since the moment of its creation in the late 18th century, which is that America was creating such a different kind of society, such a different form of rule. That small r Republican rule was so fragile and so prone to degenerating either into oligarchy or democracy, which was understood as the rule of the mob, that America had to take extraordinary measures to insulate itself from the corrupting effects of Europe. And as with most myths, the question is not, in political terms, the validity of the myth and actual cold-hearted analysis. It's the degree to which that myth is believed and its ability to activate political movements, political sentiment. And the United States, in many respects, was not ready for the degree of international involvement that Wilson thrust upon it. And so the reaction to that is furious. And because it has such a deep rootedness in American history and in the American psyche, it is something that can be called up in one generation after another. And the United States had a long period of internationalism, which we might regard as a long exception. And that what is going on today is very familiar to pre-19 17 understandings of American history. So the connection that you're drawing, my long-winded answer is a way of saying is the correct and necessary one.
You might say there are two things going on here. There's the broad tradition of American isolationism, suspicion of a nefarious wider world, particularly suspicion of Europe. We can see all of that in play today. And then there's the tighter connection between that and economic protectionism. And those two things have tended to go together. You've described it in the 20th century, as well as the 19th, as well as the 18th. But it's almost like we're living in an age where there was an assumption that that had been broken, that the second half of the 20th century, the globalization story, yes, Americans might still have this instinctive revulsion against the world, pulling up of the drawbridge, but they're not literally going to impose new tariffs. And we are going to have to come back to Smoot-Hawley because I've jumped the story ahead, but I really want to talk about this because it is so interesting whether Trump has tapped into something deep, that connection, or actually it had been broken in a way, that a long period of a free trade world, for all of the costs and losses that American industry and others have suffered, all the rest, that tight link between fear of the outside world and tariffs, which Trump has he's tried to just join these two things together to relock them in place in the way that would have been completely familiar in the 1890s. It now feels jolting, jarring.
Yes, I think it is jarring. If you ask whether that link between tariffs and fear of the outside world have been broken, the answer is yes. But I would also say that in the United States, quite apart from the tariff issue, the fear of the outside world had been broken in the way it had been expressing itself prior to World War I. There was still a great fear of parts of the world, that being the communist world and the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But unlike other threats from America, the Cold War demanded of the United States a higher rather than lower degree of international involvement. In other words, the understanding of communism is that this was an international threat, that it wouldn't work to just create a fortress America and wall America off from the rest of the world, that America needed allies in the rest of the world. And so from the 1940s through the early 90s, the Cold War dictates a kind of internationalism for the sake of American security that had never existed before. And that clearly overrides the fear of Europe and facilitates something radically different, a deep Western alliance. Churchill and Roosevelt, the Atlantic Charter in 1941, which has got to guide American policy for the next 70 years until Trump arrives. So that older sense of isolationism and the need to protect America from Europe and to establish a kind of fortress protected by oceans on both sides is overridden by the fear of communism and the understanding that this requires a kind of international involvement and engagement that America had not been compelled to do before. And it's interesting in that regard about how internationalist the Republican Party becomes. And some of it's what I would call its disorientation today stems from the end of the Cold War and what it had poured a couple generations of energy into. What do you replace that mission with? What do you replace that internationalism with? So it's not an accident that a Trump-like figure trying to recall an earlier period of American history can appear and flourish only after the Cold War ended. That's one major factor. And the other major factor is the rise of China, which in the larger sense signifies the end of the American century. If an American century can be thought to have existed, I would say it began in 1917 when America went to war in World War I and ended with the election of Trump in 2016. That's a century almost exactly 99 years. And part of what's going on now is a sense of America having and this is what Trump expresses, a sense of decline, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms to the rise of China. And the world is moving to a new world order, which has got to be something other than Pax Americana. And the consequences of that were already evident after the admission of China to the WTO in 2001. The China shock, the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs that occurred between 2001 and 2010, 2011, it also informs the turn to Trump. And these are some of his core supporters, industrial districts of the U.S. and parts of the Midwest, small towns that have been left to rot by the exodus of manufacturing jobs abroad. So between the end of the Cold War and the rise of China, and I should say China is no longer a communist nation in any meaningful sense. It's run by a Leninist organization, but it's fully operative in the capitalist world. And whatever the future is going to hold, China is going to have a very prominent place in that world. And that means the end of the privileged position that America has held since the end of the Cold War.
But we do now have to fill in one key part, I think, of that American century story, which plays a big role in the break between the idea that tariffs are a way of America protecting itself from the outside world. And that is Smoot-Hawley, because the key fact about Smoot-Hawley is that it was signed into law in 1930 after the crash. And though in 1930 it wasn't clear where the American or the world economy were heading, this might be a temporary blip at that point. No one knew at that point it was going to be the Great Depression, though I think some people feared the worst. But the logic that, as you said, underpinned these arguments in the 1920s, tariffs, we're booming, no tariffs, agriculture is struggling. By the time these higher tariffs come in 1930, that logic has been broken. And it is the breaking of that logic because Smoot-Hawley comes, does it not, to be associated with what comes next, which is not boom time.
Yes, it's so interesting that this very detailed piece of legislation had been drawn up for months and even more than a year in committees, congressional hearings, very detailed schedules for every good imaginable on which tariffs are going to be levied or higher tariffs. But this is not passed, and Hoover is not a big supporter. He's become a big supporter of agricultural tariffs, but he doesn't see the need for higher industrial tariffs. It's not clear this would have passed, but it's not yet the Great Depression, but the stock market crash of October 1929. And if it had passed, Hoover may well have used his veto to veto it and prevent it from becoming law. The stock market had been elevated to unprecedented heights for several years prior to 1929, as often happens in these moments of mad capitalism. The belief develops that it will never come down again. More and more people buy into the market. Very few protections in the market in terms of what was called buying on margins. You could use 10% of the purchase price of a stock to purchase a stock with the expectation that the value would keep on going up and you could pay back what you had borrowed from future earnings. That is shattered in the 3 months after the October crash, and America is panicking, and it doesn't know what to do. It has not suffered this degree of stock market collapse in a very long time. And so one of the things it does is to reflexively pass tariffs. It's worked for us in the past. It's protected American industry and manufacturing in the past. It will protect us again. That's one element, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But I also want to flag the very inappropriate response of the Fed to the great crash of 1929. It's a new institution. It doesn't really know what it's doing. It doesn't have authority. It doesn't have experience. And there does seem to be a moment after Smoot-Hawley has passed when things do stabilize, but it turns out to be a false recovery, a false dawn. And the next thing that happens, which is really devastating for the global economy, is that a score of nations or more respond to American tariffs with their own retaliatory tariffs and the calamitous effect. And that is completely unanticipated in the United States and speaks to a lack of understanding within the United States among politicians, among the political class in particular, of its role in the world and how it has to be protected. Retaliatory tariffs had not been anticipated, and it's those retaliatory tariffs that plunge the entire world into what would become the Great Depression. And from late 1930 to 1932, the catastrophe of bank closures, unemployment, shrinkage of manufacturing, loss of GNP, this becomes a depression unlike America had ever experienced before. And if we understand the retaliatory tariffs as something American lawmakers should have anticipated if they had been wiser and would have been able to avoid. So it's not Smoot-Hawley necessarily by itself that triggers the Great Depression. It is the retaliatory tariffs that other nations are taking. And of course, the nations that figure most prominently are the industrial nations of Europe, which have suffered severely from World War I, the devastation of their economic plant, and they are heavily dependent on American loans. They can't repay these American loans unless they can ship goods to America, and the whole basis for international exchange is undercut by Smoot-Hawley. And so European countries and other countries as well, out of desperation for their own economies and this instinct for self-preservation, impose these retaliatory tariffs. And if we want to understand the stigma attached to Smoot-Hawley, it's not the schedule of tariffs itself that produces the scorn for that move. It's the failure to anticipate the kind of world that Smoot-Hawley made, which was to destroy an international trading system for nearly a generation.
In that story, to me, the mystery in some ways is Hoover, because as you said, before the crash, he might well have vetoed this. He was in favor of tariffs for farming and agriculture, but presumably he shared the Henry Ford view that in manufacturing, in industry, America was now not just a global player, but the global player. The world market was America's market, and this was self-defeating. Then the crash happens, and he concludes, well, now we need to do this reflex defensive thing that we traditionally do when we're in trouble. I understand why a congressman from somewhere or other might not have anticipated the international economic consequences of this, but it feels a little like Hoover had a sense of it already. This is a global story. America is part of a global economy. And yet, come 1930, his instinct is to side with Congress, which is seeing this in much narrower terms. He had a broader vision than Congress. So was it panic? Was it the crash was such a dislocation psychologically to a country that had been booming for a decade? You might think, and we're going to come on to the question of when and how the president acquired as part of his job to set tariffs, but you might think it was part of the president's job, unlike Congress, to see the international context of some of this. So why did Hoover not see it?
Part of it is panic. He can't believe this is happening under his watch. Remember, he is the man who said America is closer to eliminating poverty than any society in the history of the world. He said that in 1928. He's barely been president. And part of the mystery is how skilled and smart a man Hoover was. Engineering degree from Stanford, global mining engineer.
And experience of Europe, crucially experience of Europe after the war.
After the war, but also years spent in Australia and other South Africa, other mining regions. He knew the world as few other Americans did and had an appreciation and wanted to usher America into a more internationalist posture. And he also understood a lot more about economics and business than, say, someone like Trump, for example, does today. And so you would have expected a different response. But one of the questions that each of us face is what happens when a catastrophe happens in our lives that we are utterly unprepared for? Will we have the flexibility, the resourcefulness, the resilience to cope, or will we lapse into orthodoxy? And part of Roosevelt's strength was his experimental nature. He wasn't afraid to fail. He wasn't afraid to try different things. Hoover is much more worried about departing from orthodoxy, and his reflex is to be orthodox. And this has worked for the Republican Party for a generation. There are many people in the Republican Party who are suspicious of him because he is far too much an internationalist, and he's not the Republican president they prefer. They prefer someone like Calvin Coolidge over Hoover. So he pisses a lot of people off. He's very arrogant. So in his party, he's a relatively weak figure relative to other Republicans. And so it's partly panic, partly a sense of his own isolation and his relapse into a kind of orthodoxy. And then he is under enormous pressure from the Republican Party, which is in a greater state of panic. And he is facing mass resignations by his cabinet if he goes through with the veto that he's contemplating. So he's facing a full-scale revolt in the Republican Party, and he's asking himself, given my tenuous place in the Republican Party, do I have the strength to withstand this? Will this impair my chances for re-election in 1932? And of course, in 1930, if you're thinking about re-election, you're not worried about the Democrats who he had crushed in 1928. He's worried more about, well, the dreaded primary challenge, right? Someone who's got to challenge me from within the party. That's what he's worried about. So it's a combination of panic, the reflex of orthodoxy, combined with the deep fear of his own future being challenged within the Republican Party that inclines him to do this. There was also a letter from more than 1,000 economists pleading with him. Henry Ford comes to him, pleads with him. Thomas Lamont, who has inherited the chief executive position at J.P. Morgan, still the most powerful bank in America, is willing to get down on a knee to plead with him, and he won't respond to them because he feels the crisis is too great. And one could say a very smart man, a very successful man in all walks of life, freezes up at this moment and is incapable of showing the independence of mind and the judgment and the willingness to depart from orthodoxy that is sometimes required in moments of crisis.
It's a very revealing picture of presidential power at that period because, on the one hand, the economists say don't do it. The business people say don't do it. People beg him not to do it. Or rather, they beg him to do the thing that he won't do, which is veto. And he holds firm. He's not going to give way to economists or business people. On the other hand, he's incredibly weak in a way that Trump isn't now, in the sense that he is at the mercy of Congress. He is at the mercy of his cabinet. If Trump's cabinet threatened to resign, he'd just replace them. That's not driving him one way or the other. It's this interesting picture of a presidency which is in flux. The power of the presidency is always a work in progress. But at that point, in a way, the thing that comes over almost is the weakness and not the strength.
I think that's right. We might say that Hoover is the last of the older presidents, or he's the last president to govern America where there was a different balance of power between Congress and the presidency. Because part of Roosevelt's campaign is not simply to dramatically alter the policies that the U.S. is pursuing, and we can get into that in a moment. He is also grabbing power for the presidency in times of depression. He gains a power to change tariffs without Congress's consent. Smoot-Hawley becomes the last major tariff agreement in American history that required congressional approval. Pretty stunning moment in that regard. So one can say that the perception of crisis afflicting Hoover at this moment prompts his successor not simply to reverse legislative policy on a whole range of matters, but to insist that America can only function if the power and responsibilities of the executive are broadened. And Roosevelt, of course, inaugurates the modern presidency. I hesitate to use this word, especially for an audience that is heavily British, but we might call Hoover the last of the pre-modern presidents in America. And so it is a testament to weaknesses in the presidential role that he feels very keenly. And he himself does not feel comfortable exercising the kind of executive power that Roosevelt is going to say, I must have in order to guide America through first depression and then war.
So Smoot-Hawley is part of the reason why today it's Trump and not Congress who gets to set tariff policy. And that's partly because Smoot-Hawley itself has become a byword for failed legislation. It was a disaster. At what point did people come to understand it as a disaster? How long did it take for the penny to drop and for people to understand that the timing of this had been terrible and also profoundly counterproductive? If this was going to protect America, keep America out of being ensnared in what was going on in the wider world, it had the opposite effect. It dragged America down with the rest of the world. When did the penny drop?
About 18 months.
Right, that quickly. So it didn't take Roosevelt's election for the penny to drop.
His election was a manifestation
Of the penny having dropped.
of the penny having dropped. And Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hawley are both gone from office. They both lose in 1932. Smoot was a senator from Utah, Hawley a congressman from Oregon. Very powerful people in Congress. Smoot was head of the Senate Finance Committee, a very powerful committee. Hawley was head of the Appropriations Committee, a very powerful committee in the House. So these were senior, powerful figures. Their careers are effectively ended by Smoot-Hawley, and one of them is primaried in 1932 and the other loses a general election. And one can say that the Republican Party is destroyed by the Great Depression, and Smoot-Hawley is central to that destruction. The Republican Party had seen itself as the dominant party in America since McKinley's time. I think they're not wrong in thinking that. They saw the Wilson years as a kind of aberration. They won 3 elections after Wilson, 1920, 1924, 28. They expected that domination to continue. They expected American protectionism to continue, and their legitimacy as a governing party is destroyed really in a matter of months or a couple years. And Roosevelt does not win an overwhelming election in 1932, but it's a clear election. And then he's going to win the overwhelming election of 1936, giving the Democratic Party the kind of dominance in American politics that the Republicans had enjoyed arguably for 30 years prior to that time. So Smoot-Hawley, the scorn heaped upon it is partly a reflection of the damage it did to the Republican brand for a generation or more, arguably a generation and a half. If you ask when does the Republican Party recover its moxie of the sort that it had prior to the Great Depression, it's probably not until the 1970s and perhaps arguably the 80s. So it's a long stretch of time when their policies are going to be the policies that rule America.
And by the time it recovers its moxie, say with Reagan is going to challenge many elements of the Roosevelt settlement, of the New Deal order, but he's not going to challenge free trade, is he? So the legacy of Smoot-Hawley, you get your moxie back, but you don't forget the lesson of Smoot-Hawley, which is, yes, then it led to an expansion of government because Roosevelt came in, and these are all sorts of things that we might have a problem with, but we must remember the cause, the original cause. That was our original sin. And it's only Trump, really, who has taken us back. There's a long period of Republicans having their moxie back, but they're not going back to tariffs.
Right. Reagan is a deeply committed internationalist, and he's a cold warrior. Communism can destroy the world abroad and at home. America has to combat it everywhere, and that requires a big military presence of America in the world on the one hand and free trade on the other. So he supports the systems put in place after World War II to build a world that still has some tariffs in effect, but nothing approaching the levels of the early decades of the 20th century. It should be said that one of Roosevelt's first acts in 1934 is to pass the Reciprocal Trade Agreement. And that's significant in 2 ways. First, it is the act that empowers the president to negotiate tariff agreements on his own without the approval of Congress. But it's also interesting that it leaves the judgment of which tariff will be removed and which will remain in place. It leaves that in the hands of the executive. It doesn't do what Democrats had done before. Okay, the tariffs are up to 40 or 45 or 50%. We're going to put them down to 25%. It does not engage in a unilateral action of that sort. It says we're going to negotiate this country by country, and we're going to leave that in the hands of the president because given the calamity that Smoot-Hawley produced, Congress is no longer fit for purpose for this kind of role in the economy.
And how much of that is a legacy of the thing that you mentioned earlier, which is Smoot-Hawley, as well as appearing to be fundamentally wrong on principle, it was a kind of massive misunderstanding of its likely global consequences. It also looked very petty in its politicking. That is, it looked like a product of a kind of politics that was incapable of seeing the bigger picture, because in the end, it was all horse trading. How much of that is also part of that legacy?
Very much so. One district is concerned about another as the world burns.
And they're trading off, I'll offer you this protection in exchange for you offering me that. Whatever it would be. In my district, we make screws, and in your district, you make saddles, and away we go.
In a larger sense, it's very much an indictment of Congress and the political class for not understanding the changing position of America in the global economy, which comes out of World War I. The advances of the U.S. economy as a result of World War I are so stunning that it really requires a different understanding of how America is to interact with the world. And Roosevelt is seen as someone with that kind of international vision, and the willingness to hand him that kind of power and to push Congress out of the picture is a reflection of, you use the word petty. Pettiness is a good word. Pettiness of Congress in the face of international crisis, and the need for someone to stand up and understand what was going on and put America in a position both to take care of its own house and to put the world into some kind of order. But Roosevelt's going to have to struggle for another 7 years to arouse support in America for involving America in another international conflagration. And part of what persists through his first 2 terms is a continuing deep suspicion of America's involvement in world affairs in a sense that an unholy alliance of globalist political leaders and private capital have the power to take America in the wrong direction. So we shouldn't entirely ignore that argument and the positive elements that it has in the sense of understanding that there is a struggle between elites and the people going on in American society. And that is an issue that needs to be attended to. And part of Trump's popularity is his ability to recall that division between elites and the people, even as he does it in a profoundly misguided and damaging way.
I want to ask you another question about Trump in a second, but as I was talking to you before, I found myself thinking, so I hadn't planned to use those examples, screws and saddles. I was thinking, where do they come from? So I know where screws came from because we've just recorded and put out an episode with Robert Saunders about the tariff fight in Britain at the turn of the 20th century, and Joseph Chamberlain, the great champion of tariffs. His family business, he was in the screw business. That's how they made their money. So that's clearly where that came from. And then saddles, I think I was reaching for sort of relics of an earlier age. And it is one of the interesting things about Smoot-Hawley, particularly reading about Smoot. So as I understand it, one of the things that he was frightened of was he thought America had become too productive. There was a risk of a kind of glut because America was just producing too much. It was happening too fast. Things were changing too quickly. The 1920s, it was transforming from a horse-based to an automobile economy. Manufacturing and production were being completely transformed. There were, forms of automation that were remarkable at the time. Some of the panics about automation we have now were there then. Presumably, this was also, at least a little bit, a sort of fear of the new, that they understood America as an economy that they were familiar with. These two men, Smoot-Hawley, they weren't young men, they were old men. They'd been in Congress or in the Senate for 20 years, 30 years. There's a kind of clinging on to a past that's gone in Smoot-Hawley, which probably explains some of the then post-1929 panic. You cling even harder to the thing that's gone.
Yes, and part of what's going in the 1920s is agriculture itself. It's not going, but it's being transformed ruthlessly. You mentioned new machines and the arrival of the tractor invades farms in a major way in the 1920s and pushes a lot of people out of work. It's significant that both these people are from primarily agricultural states, not industrial states. And America only becomes, in a technical sense, an urban nation in 1920, but not really, because the definition of urban is a town of 2,500 people or more. And if you were to say, well, we should elevate that to a majority of Americans living in cities of 50,000 or more, and that's not achieved even in 1920 or maybe not even 1930. It will be achieved by 1940. So America still sees itself as an agricultural nation. Agriculture seems to be in a spiraling and endless crisis. And agriculture speaks to the soul of America. Where is American democracy strongest? Well, it's with Thomas Jefferson and the yeoman farmer and the independent producer. So part of what's being squeezed out in the 1920s, especially as farming is going much more towards corporatization, industrial farming, there's a great fear of the disappearance of the family farm. And with the family farm goes the yeoman farmer, the independent producer, the virtuous citizen who is the final line of defense for American democracy. So once again, we come to the political being intertwined with the economic. And these two elderly men feel this eclipse of rural America very, very strongly. And this struggle versus the old and the new is ripping apart America in the 1920s. The conflict between the city and the countryside, which manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Prohibition, sexuality, the diversity and cosmopolitanism of cities versus the evangelical white character of rural areas. This is going on all the time, all around, and America seems to be accelerating at an ever greater pace. So the sense of the new it's not just the new winning, but the new obliterating the old. And part of what the old that might be obliterated is democracy and liberty itself. So these are all in play in the 1920s, powerfully affecting these constituencies. And the other sign of the new, and this is the fear of the new everywhere in the world, not just the United States, is Henry Ford, the Elon Musk of his generation, revolutionizing production, producing cars at a rate and for a cheapness that no one believed could be done. I could be wrong about these figures. It's been a while since I looked at them, but the increase in the number of cars on the road from around 1915 to 1925 or 1930s is like 5 million to 27 million. It's an extraordinary transformation. And Henry Ford and the principles of scientific management are scaring the hell out of industrialists all over the world. They're scaring the hell out of the communists. And so when it comes time for Stalin to industrialize, who does he get to advise him on how to build his plants and how to become competitive with the United States? They are the engineers and architects of Henry Ford himself, who are brought over to the Soviet Union. So the powerful sense of the new, of America rushing into a new world that no one completely understands or can grasp, and that there might be dangers with this rush, is very much on the minds of people. And I don't know these two legislative figures intimately, but it's entirely because the legislation that bears their name sort of destroyed them as figures to reckon with in American history. But it wouldn't at all surprise me that they were of this older generation, concerned about the decline of virtue, liberty, and democracy in America.
We almost would need a whole nother podcast to do the Henry Ford-Musk comparison. There is a very interesting parallel here. As you said, Ford begged Hoover to veto the tariffs. He didn't. I think Musk, at some point or another, we probably don't know about it, has gone to Trump and begged him not to do it, and Trump has ignored him. There's a parallel in presidential power and the relative power of the most powerful businessman of the age. But I want to ask you a last question. This is my question. It's also the question my wife, Helen, our producer on this podcast on PPF, really wants me to push you on, because like me, she's baffled by this. It's the disanalogy in this story. It's where the stories aren't parallels, they're kind of through the looking glass. In the case of Hoover, the question is, Congress is doing this thing that with hindsight we can see was a big mistake. Why didn't he stop it? He was the president. He had veto power, and you've explained some of the reasons why not. And then Smoot-Hawley explains why the power moves to the presidency and why it becomes this tariff by tariff power. There's a sort of historical explanation there. So we're now in the world where Trump can do this stuff. So my question, Helen's question, is where the hell is Congress in this story? Where are the people's representatives? Where is the Senate? The cabinet is one thing. Trump's cabinet are a curious bunch, and I don't think one looks to them for resistance. But what have we learned about presidential power and the relative power of Congress over the last few weeks in the light of the fact that Trump just seems to be untrammeled by fear of Congress?
One of the most stunning developments in this moment is Congress's complicity in its marginalization. Trump, it's clear, has no use for Congress. He wants to be a king. He rules by decree. That's what he's doing with his flood of executive orders. He has almost no interest in legislation. There may be one significant piece of legislation that comes out of the first 2 years, the tax cut. Nothing else, nothing on immigration, nothing on a whole variety of other issues. What I don't understand, and so I can't really answer Helen's question, and I ask this of people all the time, how do we understand the inability of Republican senators and congresspeople to stand up and say, you will not do this without consulting us. You will not obliterate us from the American system of government. This is a story that's been developing for a long period of time. And I think in my understanding of it, I would start it in the 1990s and intensifying during the era of McConnell under Obama, reflecting first a disorientation of the party in the wake of the end of the Cold War and not being able to find another mission that could sustain them, and becoming more a force of obstruction than a force of legislation and democratic rule. And I assign someone like McConnell a lot of responsibility for his behavior during the Obama presidency, where he seemed to have lost interest in passing legislation and was content simply to obstruct Obama at every turn. And the only thing he was accomplishing was gaining control of the federal judiciary through appointments in the Senate, thinking that Republicans could be a minority party as long as they had control of the judiciary and the presidency, and this would become a satisfactory form of rule. He was, by his own behavior, undermining the significance of Congress as a legislative body. And in some ways, he paves the way for Trump, because the argument that Trump was making is that look at America's political system, look at this separation of powers, look at this swamp, which is not just donors to the political process. Look at the mess that Washington has made of government in America. And his critique was not entirely off base because Congress had so immobilized itself during the Obama years because of McConnell's opposition that many Americans got frustrated, angry, and became far more amenable to a strong man willing to come into office and say, I'm going to get things done, even if I have to break things. And if I have to break the power of Congress to do it, I will. The most surprising element of that is Congress's own acquiescence to their being rendered impotent. And this, along with Westminster, arguably are the two premier legislative bodies in the world and have been that way for a couple hundred years. And why Congress has not fought harder to protect itself in the face of efforts to eclipse its power remains a mystery to me. But there's what I would insist on is a longer history here, a gradual erosion of Congress's power, the inability to take command, the willingness of the Republican Party under McConnell to be nothing but an obstructionist force, which creates a groundswell of support for a strong man to come in and break things and shake things up. And that is what Trump is currently doing.
Do you think it's possible that the mirroring of the earlier story could include, in that case, Congress screws up tariff policy and it empowers the presidency? It's not the only reason why, but it is a big reason why. There's probably a consensus now that the presidency is screwing up tariff policy. There's probably a consensus within the Republican Party, or at least a terror, that this president, using his executive power and using the kind of people around him, tariff policy by ChatGPT, could make a real mess of this in the way that voters feel it. They feel it in their pocket. They feel it in the price of goods. They feel it in their economic opportunities. This could be the moment where the balance shifts back again. Congress screwed up in 1930, and you got a powerful president coming out of that. Trump screws up. Could Congress get its mojo back out of this?
I certainly hope so. There are two parts to that, or two answers I want to give you. One, if American democracy is going to regain its health, and it's not as though a constitutional crisis is coming to America, it is present in America as I speak. And if America is to recover its health as a democracy, Congress is going to have to recover its power and become jealous of its prerogatives and assert its role in democratic governance as the principal body that speaks for the American people. So that has to happen in order for American democracy to recover. And this may be a moment, like Smoot-Hawley, where something profoundly shifts. Here, my other answer is not as hopeful and as optimistic. Is there going to be a catastrophe, an economic catastrophe on the scale of the Great Depression that is going to be required for this kind of shift in America's political system to occur? I see no way that the Trump administration, with its current people in place, has the competence to negotiate 70 trade deals, let alone 10 or maybe even 5. So the potential for upending the global trading and financial systems through incompetence and unnecessary risk-taking remains very high. And so I hope that Congress will find a way to rebalance American government, reversing Smoot-Hawley without leading America into another great and devastating depression that it took the United States and the world a generation to recover from.
A reminder that you can find out, we hope, everything that you might want to know about this podcast, including all of our past series, by going to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, on the history of ideas of globalization, I'm talking to the economic historian Leah Downey about the role that's been played in the story of globalization by central banks. And we're going to try and make sense of what's going on between Trump and the Fed today. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.